What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Mindfully Mad. Today, we're diving into something that's been on my mind a lot lately. How we think about mental health, diagnosis, and healing. More specifically, I want to talk about critical psychology, a perspective that questions a lot of what we've been taught about mental illness, treatment, and even identity. So let's get into it. Have you ever wondered if the way we define mental health is a little off? Like, what if the labels we use, such as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, aren't just describing people, but actually shaping who they become? That's one of the main ideas in critical psychology. It's about stepping back and putting psychology itself under a microscope. For a long time, mental health has been treated almost like madness, something broken that needs to be fixed. And because of that, we've misdiagnosed illnesses, overprescribed medications, and sometimes reduced complex human experiences down to a single label. But humans are messy, right? We're messy. We're shaped by history, culture, politics, family, community, all these forces around us. So how can a one-word diagnosis ever really capture all of that? This brings me to the work of philosopher Ian Hacking. He had this really powerful idea called making up people. Basically, Hacking argues that categories like mental illness or even criminal behavior aren't just discovered, they're constructed. Think about it. When experts create a label, society starts recognizing it. People start identifying with it, and that changes behavior. The label itself becomes real because people live into it, or sometimes fight against it. Let's take depression, for example. Instead of it being someone who experiences these heightened emotions of sadness or hopelessness, right? And a human who has these experiences from time to time, all of a sudden you associate with yourself with being your depression rather than somebody who experiences depression. I think that's the difference. There's nothing wrong with having that diagnosis or having that label, but when you start identifying with your label and it becomes your safety blanket, it's really, really hard to work through it, right? And I think that's where that problem comes in, and especially if you've been misdiagnosed. And honestly, it made me wonder, if someone gets misdiagnosed and starts living their life around that label, is that almost like a placebo effect, but in reverse? And it shows just how powerful these mental health categories can be, especially when they're applied without enough care or cultural awareness. And speaking of cultural awareness, misdiagnosis is actually a huge problem, especially for people outside the so-called weird demographic. So weird stands for white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Studies show that people of color and those from lower income backgrounds are more likely to be misdiagnosed with severe disorders like schizophrenia, while white patients are more often diagnosed with mood disorders. It's heartbreaking because a wrong diagnosis can lead to the wrong treatment or no real support at all. And it's not just about race or class, it's about a deeper issue, a system that wasn't built for everyone, trying to force everyone into the same narrow categories. The labeling issue gets even trickier when you look at how different cultures handle mental illness. In the US, for example, someone who hears voices is quickly diagnosed, medicalized, and often ends up isolated. But in India, As anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann points out, it's a very different story. There, mental health issues like psychosis aren't necessarily seen as something that destroys your identity. Families often step in to support loved ones without making their illness the center of who they are. As long as someone can function in daily life, hearing voices isn't immediately treated as catastrophic. And it just shows how much culture shapes not just how we diagnose, but how people actually live with and manage their experiences. It's like in the US, we're just very quick to judge people by the experiences they have. And part of that judgment is labeling them with certain disorders. And again, like there's nothing wrong with having these labels because they can help direct you towards the right steps in getting better, or helping you regulate your system to handle day-to-day stressors. But labeling is also can be very damageable because you conform to those symptoms. You identify with those symptoms. They become you. The symptoms become you, and you become the symptoms. And I think it's really hard to help heal yourself when in the back of your mind you constantly have the thought that you are broken. You need to be fixed. You are depression. You are schizophrenia. You are your disorder. You aren't your disorder. You're a human being having a human experience, right? You are a human being having this experience. You are not your disorder, right? You are somebody who experiences a disorder. And I think it's important to emphasize that distinction because, again, it's hard to heal yourself when A, you use your disorder as a safety blanket, and B, you identify with that disorder. Because when you take the steps to feel better and you can no longer identify with that illness, it almost feels empty, right? And you have to understand that an illness isn't who you are. It's what you experience. So another piece of this puzzle is how we medicalize women's emotions and experiences. Professor Dar and Professor Becker talk about how women today are more open about mental health, which is so important, right? It's really important to have that mental health awareness. But at the same time, there's a tendency to self-diagnose too quickly, to jump into labeling normal emotional responses as disorders. For example, I have seen way too many TikTok videos of people who who actually have these disorders, like they actually are diagnosed with autism or ADHD. They're talking about their experiences, which is great to normalize these diagnoses, right? But then I started reading the comment section and I started losing my mind because you'll see these younger folks or just people in general, despite age, start saying, "Oh my God, I relate to everything you said. I also now have autism," or "I must have autism," or I have ADHD, just because they saw one video or maybe two or three which they related to, and now they have self-diagnosed themselves with these disorders. And some disorders are self-diagnosable, but autism isn't one of them. And also some of these things that these people are talking about are normal emotional responses. And just because you relate to them sometimes doesn't mean you're autistic. And the thing is, it's like This is also when people, this also happens when people overuse words like trauma or depression in casual ways. Because what happens is like the words, the disorders, it loses its meaning, right? Like, for example, there's a difference to somebody saying, I'm so depressed because it's so cloudy, and like seasonal depression is such a big topic that we have. I mean, we've all been there. I've been seasonally depressed. Heck, I'm from Sweden. Of course I've been seasonally depressed. But it's very different from somebody who's truly experienced life-threatening violence or loss or grief, and it's a different type of depression. And same with trauma. Like, we throw the word trauma around as if it's candy. Like, that experience traumatized me, in the most casual way about something so trivial, compared to someone who's actually escaped war zones. They're traumatized. Becky, who had too many emails to respond to, is not traumatized. She's overwhelmed, but not traumatized. And again, when everything becomes trauma, the word starts to lose its meaning, right? And that matters because language shapes how we take our own pain and each other's pain seriously. This labeling issue gets even trickier when you look at the bigger global picture. Psychological labels like trauma and resilience have been co-opted to align with neoliberal ideologies, especially in the global south. Lilly argues that these concepts individualize complex social and political problems, shifting focus away from systematic causes like poverty, inequality, and historical injustices. Instead of addressing root causes, these concepts encourage individuals and communities to adapt to unfavorable conditions, reinforcing that personal responsibility and self-management are the keys to overcoming hardship. For example, the emphasis on resilience normalizes the idea that people must endure or bounce back from systematic issues rather than seek collective change. Trauma, on the other hand, is framed as a personal or psychological issue, often treated through therapeutic interventions, which obscures the political and economic structures that produce the conditions of suffering in the first place. By framing trauma and resilience as individual rather than collective challenges, these concepts perpetuate the neoliberal agenda, ultimately depoliticizing struggles for justice and keeping attention away from the broader forces of capitalism, colonialism, and global power imbalances that shape conditions in the global south. To quote Lilly, both me culture and neoliberalism rely on inequality and unfairness to exist. When we cannot and do not feel valued, we cannot matter, which harms our mental health and wellness. The notion that I must help myself for me does not take us far. A we culture prioritizes our worth and emphasizes empowerment and equality. Meanwhile, individualism can lead to isolation and a lack of sense of self. So instead of fighting for systematic change, people are praised for being resilient, even when what they really need is collective action, justice, and real support. It's powerful to think about how even well-intentioned ideas like healing can be used to keep the status quo intact. And finally, we have to talk about medication. Antipsychotics and antidepressants are necessary for some, no question. But critical psychology asks, are we overusing them? Research shows that long-term use of antipsychotics can actually cause the brain to become more sensitive to dopamine, a phenomenon called dopamine supersensitivity, making symptoms worse over time. And then there's the broader issue. The rise in prescriptions sometimes hides the real causes of mental distress, things like poverty, loneliness, racial injustice, or lack of opportunity. Doctors might prescribe an antidepressant to someone who's deeply struggling, but if we don't address the economic and social conditions causing that distress, is it really healing? So where does all this leave us? Critical psychology isn't about rejecting mental health care. It's actually about making it better. It's about seeing people in all their complexity instead of reducing them to a checklist of symptoms. It's about remembering that emotions are human, and sometimes suffering is a response to an unjust world, not just a brain glitch. If we want to truly support mental health, we have to zoom out. We have to look at culture, politics, economics, family, history, all of it. Because healing isn't just an individual journey. It's collective, it's cultural, it's social. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we start moving toward real wellness. Thanks for tuning in today. If this conversation resonated with you, feel free to share it, leave a review, or reach out with your thoughts. I will have the reference list down below if you want to fact check anything I've said. You can also go ahead and follow me on Instagram. It's mindfullymadpod. If you want to follow me personally, it's just Michelle Melinet. I'll have all those links down below as well. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay mindfully mad.